She was just picking up grenades. No name, no rank, no recognition. Just a quiet woman in a faded cap, sifting through shrapnel, while elite soldiers strutted past her like she was invisible. Until one cocky Special Forces sniper mocked her from across the range and handed her his weapon, thinking it was a joke. What happened next silenced an entire NATO task force, shattered every ego on the field, and revealed a truth buried so deep it didn't even exist on paper. If you think you know what strength looks like, think again. Subscribe now for more true stories of hidden legends and those who walk quietly among giants. She wore the contractor vest. No rank, no ribbons, just a canvas pouch slung low on her hip and calloused hands used to heat and wait. Every morning she moved through the demolition range before the operators even arrived, collecting the expired or dud frag grenades, scanning for buried fuses or scorched casing fragments. To most, she was range safety support. To most, she was invisible. The sun hadn't fully broken over the New Mexico mountains when she arrived, boots crunching over sand and gravel that still held the night's chill. She walked with that quiet, functional stride of someone who'd spent too long around things that exploded if you stepped wrong. Her hat was a sun-faded canvas, pulled low. Her gloves were scarred from fuse cuts and shrapnel tears. Her name tag had long since faded from her vest, and nobody had bothered to ask her name anyway. She was contractor, or range cleanup, or sometimes just her. The demolition range sprawled across a high desert plateau, wind-swept and sun-blasted, pocked with impact craters and burn marks. It was the kind of place where mistakes didn't get second chances, where the earth was littered with fragments of precision and failure. She moved through it like smoke, methodical, fluid, stooping to recover a burnt spoon from an M67, pausing to inspect a partial detonation near a rusted drainage berm, sorting recovered items into discrete pouches, pin failures, fuse anomalies, casing distortion. It wasn't just cleanup. It was an analysis. But the teams didn't see that. The operators showed up later, laughing and loud, clad in full kit and attitude, prepping breaching charges or practicing grenade arcs like they were tossing baseballs. They barely glanced at her. Just another civilian with a contract and a waiver. Someone to make the range safe before the real work started. Except one man noticed. A man with too much dust on his boots and too many scars on his hands to ignore details. The range chief. He watched her from the command overlook every morning. I watched the way she moved, the way she paused mid-step to assess a half-buried fuse wire most would have missed, the way she waited for silence before approaching an unexploded charge like it was a living thing. He didn't know her name either, but he'd seen a lot of operators come and go, and she didn't move like a contractor. She moved like something older, something colder, something trained. And she wasn't here to be noticed. Until the day she was. The training range in New Mexico burned like a kiln. The air shimmered even before breakfast, dust lifting in slow eddies from track tires and heavy boots. Mirage waves bent the view like heat off a stovetop, warping steel targets and distant hill contours into fluid shapes. Sweat started early and stayed late. The kind of dry heat that scraped your lungs and turned metal skin melting hot by noon. A NATO joint detachment had rotated in, the kind of rotation that made staff tighten procedures and wipe down every checklist twice. Delta was there. So were SAS shooters with clipped speech and custom rifles, Grom operators with that heavy Polish stillness, and a handful of Commandos Marine who looked like they'd rather be storming a compound than filling out fire reports. The big guns were here literally and otherwise. Every range echo carried ego. Every movement had weight. This wasn't training. It was peacetime peacocking with a live audience. And moving silently through it all was one woman in an old ball cap, faded cargo pants, and scuffed steel-toe boots. She carried a canvas grenade pouch and a dented range bucket with duct-taped seams. No one spoke to her. No one asked what she was collecting or why she paused to examine certain fragments longer than others. She worked around them without interrupting, like mist winding through a battlefield. Just another civilian, here to keep things tidy. Except the range chief was watching. He always did. Chief Warrant Officer Keene had seen more operations than most of these NATO shooters had in years. He didn't care for noise or swagger, but he cared about movement, efficiency, the way someone placed their boots when they crossed uncertain terrain. And this woman, the one nobody had been introduced to, the one who never looked up when the shots cracked, she moved differently. She tracked blast patterns without writing anything down. She nodded slightly at charge placements that were off by a few degrees. And every time a detonation rolled through the range, she turned just enough to clock the delay timing before going back to sorting brass and grenade casings like she was cataloging evidence. Keene made a note. Not a formal one, just a mental tag. There was a reason someone like that ended up here without a file thick enough to explain it. He didn't know where she'd come from, but he knew exactly what she was. Quiet wasn't the absence of noise. Sometimes it was a signal. Sergeant Callum Price was loud the way insecure men are. When they know the real killers in the room don't need to say a word. His voice carried, clipped and theatrical, bouncing off the steel range barriers like a stage actor playing soldier. He had the British flag patch on one arm, a smirk glued to his face, and the kind of confidence that didn't come from experience, it came from not realizing what he hadn't seen yet. Today was demo shoot day. Grenade launcher qualifications and distance marksmanship folded into one unofficial spectacle. Operators lined up to prove who could arc a Fordham farther, tighter, cleaner. It wasn't in the schedule, but it always happened anyway. Pride wasn't listed in the safety brief, but it was thick in the air. Price had come ready to win. He carried an AB201 modded past regulation custom glass, bipod swap, barrel sleeve with a proprietary dampener, and most notably, a side-mounted Mahan 203 style bracket he claimed was hand-fitted by some armorer in Hereford. It looked like a monster, but he treated it like a trophy. The rifle gleamed under a fresh oiling. He made sure people noticed it before they noticed him. He mocked the American instructors with overpronounced, helpful suggestions, and took playful digs at the Poles for their understated setups. To the French, he offered backhanded praise. "Good effort," he said once, watching a miss land short by 30 meters. "Just a few hundred more and it'll clear customs." But it wasn't until he glanced downrange and spotted a woman crouched near the scatter zone sorting grenade debris by fuse delay with gloved hands and surgical attention that he saw his real target. She wasn't in the kit. No plate carrier, no insignia. Just a gray tee, old vest, and a beat-up canvas hat pulled low over her brow. Price tilted his head, watching her for a moment, like a dog noticing a cat in the room. Something about her calm annoyed him. The way she sifted through detonation remnants, with the same focus he used to calibrate optics. Too quiet, too precise. Not part of the show. "Oi," he called out, voice rising over the sun, humming silence. "Are you planning to lecture us on fuse delays? Or just happy down there counting shrapnel?" A few operators chuckled. Most didn't. The kind of silence that separates those who know the game from those who just watch it. She didn't even look up. Price smiled wider, mistaking her silence for submission. It was his first real mistake of the day. "You there," Price called out across the range, his voice full of smug challenge and showman's flair. "Think you could hit something with this?" He held up the Matey 201 like it was a royal scepter, angling the attached Fordham launcher for full theatrical effect. The optic caught the sun just enough to throw glare, and a few nearby operators winced. It wasn't the weapon that bothered them. It was the tone. She didn't answer, just looked at the launcher, really looked at it. Price took the silence as bait. "Come on, then," he smirked, pacing toward her position. "Let's see what the janitorial corps can do. Bet you've got a great arm for cleaning duty." Some of the shooters laughed quick, nervous, covering their discomfort. Others looked away, focused hard on their gear like it had suddenly become interesting. Nobody stepped in. That was range culture. You earned your space, or you didn't get one. and Price knew that. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't snap back. She just finished sorting the fragment in her hand fuse wire intact. Cap melted clean and dropped it gently into her belt pouch. Then she stood, brushed the grit from her pants, and looked Price in the eye. Not long, just long enough to make him blink. She nodded once, not because she wanted the attention, not to make a point. She nodded because she'd seen the misaligned zero on his optic rail from 30 feet away, and the weight of watching him miss another long shot was heavier than simply correcting it herself. Price stepped back like he'd just summoned something he didn't quite understand. He offered the weapon with a grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. Be gentle. She's got range credentials. The woman accepted the rifle without fanfare, hands moving with a practiced ease that said she'd done this before many times, in many places. Her grip wasn't hesitant. It was intimate, familiar. She dropped prone like she was settling into an old rhythm. Up on the overlook, Chief Keen leaned forward. He'd seen this moment before, the turning point, the breath before the blast when someone underestimated the wrong person. And the shot that followed would echo long after the dust had settled. She didn't swagger. She didn't flinch. No dramatic shoulder rolls, no slow-motion magazine slaps, no cocky glances toward the crowd. She just moved clean, deliberate, quiet, like someone who had done this before. Not in front of a crowd, not for applause, but because the job had demanded it. The launcher cradled in her hands looked comically large against her frame, but the moment she touched it, the energy shifted. It wasn't the size of the weapon that mattered anymore. It was the way she handled it, like it was a wrench or a scalpel, a tool she understood intimately, one she respected, one she'd depended on. The line was 800 meters out, a steel silhouette bolted to a reinforced post, painted white and ringed with heat mirage. Not a standard test, not even a recommended one. That kind of distance for a Fordham launcher was borderline absurd. No stabilization systems, no guided fin, just a single arcing grenade and a prayer carried on physics. Price crossed his arms with the smug air of a man preparing to be entertained. He tilted his chin toward the instructors, as if to say, "Watch this." His bravado was louder now, more animated. But underneath the grin was something less sure. He wasn't used to people accepting his dares, especially not people who didn't meet his eyes when they did. The instructors fell silent. The casual chatter of multinational teams hushed down to boot scuffs and shallow breathing. Spotter teams leaned in over their scopes. Someone adjusted the mirage lens. Another whispered a wind call, not for her, but for themselves. Nobody wanted to miss the shot if it landed. Nobody wanted to miss the silence if it didn't. She checked the chamber. Clean. Scoped the bracket. Gave it one adjustment. Not a guess. A correction. She sighted downrange eyes calm. Jaw relaxed. Breathing measured. She didn't ask for corrections. She didn't ask for spotting. She just read the terrain, read the wind, and did the math in her head like she'd done it 100 times before. Keen, from the overlook, didn't speak, didn't blink, just stared through his binoculars with the kind of stillness that came from watching moments you weren't supposed to interrupt. At 800 meters, even hope had a drift factor. But she didn't fire with hope. She fired like it was a memory. The sound of the launch wasn't loud, not compared to the roar of rifles or the concussive thump of breaching charges. It was a clean, sharp thunk, the kind that didn't draw gasps, just silence. Then the arc began. You could almost trace it with your eyes, slow and precise. The grenade rose like it had all the time in the world. No wobble, no drag. It crested high over the range like a hawk circling in still air, then began its descent, a smooth, obedient fall that ended in one clean detonation. Center mass. Not near. Not close enough. Dead center. The steel silhouette shuddered under the impact. The explosion, echoing back across the range like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence nobody had expected her to write. Nobody moved. For a moment, it felt like the whole range had exhaled at once and forgotten to breathe back in. Operators frozen mid-laugh. instructors staring, spotters locked to scopes, double-checking their own math. Even the flags went still, like the wind itself had paused out of respect. Price blinked. His grin faltered, lips parting just enough to say something but not enough to sound confident. "Try again," he muttered, voice suddenly too small for the open desert. She did. No hesitation, no showmanship, just a slight adjustment, a breath, and a second launch. 900 meters. The target had been repainted that morning. White, clean, untouched. Now it bore a new center scorch, the kind you couldn't fake with good luck or borrowed gear. The murmurs started, low voices in multiple accents. Words like fluke and hell of a shot collided with rising tones of disbelief. Then came the third round. 0 meters. A moving silhouette, mounted on a track. Simulated target drift for combat realism. Even seasoned operators had trouble tagging it with a rifle at that range. She led the motion perfectly. Wind call, drop compensation, timing all in her head, none of it spoken. The launch was fluid. The detonation hit mid-drift. Direct impact. This time, the silence didn't return. There was applause, but not the loud kind. The slow, unsure kind clapping from people who weren't sure whether they'd just seen a contractor get lucky or witnessed something they weren't cleared to understand. Nobody was laughing anymore, not even Price. "What's your background?" one of the French operators asked, his voice barely above the hum of wind brushing through scorched scrub. It wasn't a challenge. It was reverent. Curious, but cautious the way someone might ask a question they weren't sure they wanted. Answered. She didn't stop moving, didn't square up or offer credentials, just gave a slight shrug, eyes still scanning the launcher she'd just set down on the range table. "Here and there," she said, as casually as if they were talking about places she'd vacationed. But it landed like a grenade in a closed room. Chief Keene heard the exchange from the overlook, hands folded in front of him, sunglasses shading eyes that saw more than they admitted. He didn't smile, didn't nod, but he recognized the dodge. "Here and there" was a phrase he'd only ever heard from people who'd signed enough NDAs to forget their real middle names. It wasn't evasive, it was protective. A simple way of saying don't ask unless you're ready to carry what comes with the answer. Her file said nothing special. A civilian contractor, prior service, logistics, some range safety certifications, no combat MOS, no deployment history flagged, not on paper. But paper didn't mean much to Keene, not when you'd been around long enough to know how easy it was to bury things too dangerous to be forgotten, but too real to be remembered. Years ago, there'd been a program, off-book, cross-branch, selective to the point of absurdity. They didn't pull from the top of the stack, they pulled from the shadows beneath it. Female operators trained in the kind of insertion tactics and long-range platform work that didn't get briefed even at the 5-star level. Their names were burned before the ink dried. No citations, no medals, just rumors and sealed boxes in windowless buildings. And then one day, the program disappeared. No scandal, no funeral, just gone. Some whispered they'd been reintegrated. Others said they'd been scattered, retired early with new IDs and forgettable assignments, cleaning up brass, sorting grenades, watching from behind the curtain until someone called them out into the open. Now, one of them had stepped back into the light, and the world was suddenly paying attention. By the afternoon, the range felt different. It wasn't louder, it wasn't quieter, just more alert. Conversations didn't trail off. When she passed, they stopped completely. Eyes followed her now, but not in the dismissive way they had that morning. Now it was the kind of attention reserved for people who had done something no one else dared to try, and even fewer could explain. She still wore the same sun-faded ball cap, same scuffed boots, same bucket, but nobody asked her to pick up brass anymore. Instead, they asked her about ballistic drop at 900 meters, about spin drift in crosswinds over open desert, about fuse tolerances on mid-range impact arcs. They offered their rifles for her opinion like students handing in exams they already knew were flawed. She didn't speak much, just small corrections. A half-step tweak to a bipod position. A quick glance at a dope card followed by a quiet, "That range call's 2 miles off." She never raised her voice. She never gave orders, but every word she said rearranged the air like a cold front. Even Price returned. No swagger this time, no grin. Just his launcher held respectfully in both hands, like a man bringing a gift to someone who'd already proven their worth. "Can you—" He paused, swallowing pride that had once been his favorite meal. "Check my zero." She nodded once, took the weapon, didn't make a show of it. Just laid it on the bench, checked the optic tension, re-leveled the mount with a tool she pulled from her vest pouch, and dialed in the elevation like she'd built the sight herself. No flourish. No lecture. Just competence as quiet as it was unshakable. When she handed it back, Price didn't say much. He just looked at her the way men sometimes do when they realize they've spent years chasing a standard they didn't know already existed. Like someone who just learned the difference between talent and mastery. By the end of the day, her nickname wasn't Contractor anymore. They'd started calling her Ma'am, not because of rank, not because of age, because it felt like the only word that carried the weight she'd earned in silence. The next morning started the same way it always did, sun bleeding over the ridge, dust curling off the gravel, the low hum of generators winding up for another scorched day. But inside the range office, things had already shifted. The phone rang before the coffee had brewed. Direct line. No prefix, no chatter, just a clipped voice from somewhere up the chain. "Who's the woman who made the 1K grenade shot?" Chief Keene didn't answer right away. He just stared out the office window, watching her move along the demolition pits like nothing had changed. Same bucket, same gloves, same quiet grace. He could still see the steel target she'd hit now bent, blackened, and circled in orange chalk for replacement. A monument nobody talked about, but nobody ignored. The voice on the phone pressed. Paperwork inquiries followed. Names, serial numbers, service affiliations. Keene forwarded what little he had. The file was thin, deliberately so. A few training certs, a contract reference number, a personnel photo that looked like it had been printed from a fax machine. There was no deployment history, no medals, no rank. Just enough to look legitimate, just enough to look forgettable. That afternoon, the replies started to trickle in. One came from a naval liaison office, buried behind layers of meaningless acronyms. No record found. Another came back encrypted, then self-deleted after 30 seconds. But the last one arrived via a secure message queue, bounced through 4 classified nodes, and a detour through Fort Meade. It didn't have a header. It didn't include a sender. It only said, "To do not engage Tier 0 designation." Keene stared at it for a long time. Not surprised. Just confirmed. He'd worked with enough ghosts to recognize one. People like her didn't exist on spreadsheets. They weren't part of units. They were the unit. Pulled from dark places to do darker work, and then tucked away again when their usefulness threatened to outshine the names on command rosters. He deleted the message, shut down the line, and poured his coffee slowly. Outside, she knelt to examine a burnt fuse ring, turning it in gloved fingers like it still had something to say. She wasn't there to be found. But someone, somewhere, had noticed. And that meant everything was about to change. She arrived the next day like she always had before the trucks, before the range warm-ups, before the flags stirred in the wind. The sun hadn't cleared the ridgeline yet, but the light was already hard. She moved like she always did, quiet, efficient, focused, sorting dud grenades and pressure caps into separate compartments on her canvas mat. Hands steady, posture relaxed, like nothing had changed. But it had. The change wasn't loud. It wasn't even spoken. It was posture. It was silent. It was the way conversations paused when she passed not out of awkwardness, but deference. Respect had arrived in its most serious form. Earned, unannounced and irreversible. Operators who had barely glanced at her the week before now nodded when she passed. Not forced, not performative, just a gesture that said, "I saw what you did. I know what it means." Snipers who once measured each other by range cards and confirmed kills now found themselves measuring against her 3 silent hits at 285 meters with someone else's launcher and no warm-up, and they were all coming up short. She didn't acknowledge the shift, didn't lean into it. That wasn't her style. She still knelt in the dust, still examined fractured casings like a crime scene tech, still waited for the pause between detonations before she crossed into the scatter zones. If anything, she became more invisible now that everyone was looking. A shadow surrounded by questions no one had the clearance to ask. Even Price had changed. He passed her once that morning, launcher slung respectfully on his back, eyes down until she nodded. Just once. Just enough. He didn't try to speak. I didn't need to. Keene watched from the overlook again, arms crossed, coffee cooling in his hand. He didn't bother pulling her file anymore. He knew what he needed to know. The rest of it, the training, the missions, the things she'd seen and done, those lived somewhere else, somewhere deeper. And every operator who watched her now couldn't help but wonder, how many others are out here? How many ghosts in contractor vests, just waiting for someone to hand them a weapon and misjudge them out loud? She never raised her voice. She never sought attention. But when she moved across that range, you could feel the shift ripple out behind her like heat off steel. Quiet wasn't absent anymore. It was presence. And she was still picking up the grenades.